I can see people joining. I'll just give it another few seconds. We're 2 minutes past 10, and I think we're at 69 participants. So I think we're going to kick it off. The event is recorded, so if anybody misses the beginning, they'll have a chance to watch it later. But good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. We're so glad that you're joining us today, as we know our speakers have prepared a really interesting content on the topic of impact measurement and management. During our first fireside chat, Joanne Kellerman identified impact measurement as a key challenge in the impact space. Following up on this conversation, the Oxford Impact Collaborative organized this event in collaboration with Said Business School, University of Oxford, featuring the Impact Measurement and Management Program Director, Karim Harji, and Impact Leader, Belisa Rojas. In fact, this very hot subject of impact measurement and management and our engagement through Said Business School at University of Oxford inspired the creation of Oxford Impact Collaborative. We're 5 alumni of various Oxford Impact executive programs and are based in the US, Brazil, Dubai, South Africa, and Hong Kong. So we are truly global and extremely keen to bring action and tackle the world's wicked problems. But this evening, in Hong Kong, it's evening. So from my perspective, this evening isn't about us. It is about the prominence of the topic and the speakers we have with us today. And before I introduce them, I want to make sure that you also get the most out of this event. So please don't be shy and fire away your questions via the Q&A submission option. And now on to Karim Harji and Belisa Rojas and a few words of introduction for both of them. Belisa, you have over 15 years of experience in the international development sector, advising private sector organizations, impact investors, development banks, and foundations on how to professionalize their management and measurement practices. You are the CEO and founder of Impact Consulting, and you're currently working on the United Nations SDG's Impact team to advance the adoption of universally agreed upon standards for SDG enabling investments and enterprises and catalyze private capital to further the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Previously, you were a strategy and monitoring senior specialist at IDB Invest. We're so grateful to have you amongst us today. And Karim, at this point, I think we know you slightly better than Belisa because you were the inspiration behind the Oxford Impact Collaborative, but you are a great practitioner, educator, and researcher in impact measurement and impact investing. You're the founding program director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program at Said Business School. And to highlight a few examples of your prominent achievement in the space of impact, you are the co-chair of Impact Measurement Task Force convened by the Government of Ontario and a member of the Impact Measurement Working Group of the G8 Social Impact Investment Task Force. And you're also previously advisor to the Rockefeller Foundation on Social Impact Measurement. And you co-founded the Topical Interest Group on Social Impact Measurement at the American Evaluation Association. I'll stop here. And I'll turn it over to both of you. And once again, welcome Belisa and Karim, and we're so grateful to have you amongst us today.
Thanks, Nadi. That was a great introduction, and nice to see so many familiar faces, but also a lot of new ones. I'm really excited about what OIC has done to date, and we have a lot more to kind of talk through in terms of the topic of IMM. And we want to get to know all of you as well. You know, Belisa and I, we're framing this conversation as really a conversation between practitioners. As you'll hear about later in our discussion, we chat regularly about how we are seeing how standards are emerging, what practices we're using, how we deal with some of the tensions and challenges. And so we want to give you a bit of a peek into some of those discussions and also what's top of mind for us as we think about IMM. There are a lot of experienced practitioners, and as Nadi said, a good number of alumni who are working on these issues directly. So what we're going to try and do in the second half is really invite some of those questions, the tactics, etc. Melissa, before we jump in, any comments from you just to open us up?
Well, just hello, everyone. Great introduction, and I'm very grateful for the invitation and looking forward to get all your questions and comments and make this really useful and fun too. Thank you, Karim.
So why don't we start with a bit of a poll to just see where people are at. So if maybe we can get this launched, John, just to see what your familiarity is with IMM. Are you early? Are you active, or are you even an expert? Leave this open for 30 seconds. And then we'll try and calibrate our kind of comments at that level. Okay, maybe we'll give it a few more seconds and then share the results back. Okay, why don't we close the poll and then just share some of the results back. Okay, interesting. So most of you are early or just getting started. But a good number of you are actively doing it and testing and working in it. And the 6%, the 5 of you that are experts, we probably know who you are. So we're going to actually pick on you to at various stages of our presentation. But this is helpful for us. What Melissa and I are going to do along the way, and Annabelle as well, is we're going to share links as we go. The Q&A box, please include your questions. Occasionally, we may use some jargon or terms that you're not familiar with. We had assumed some basic level of understanding and work around IMM, but if any of that feels unfamiliar to you, please let us know, and we can obviously cover that and clarify that as we go. So why don't we get started, and just to recap what we're going to do today. So Melissa and I are going to give you some of our point. Maybe I'll hand it over to Melissa actually to talk about this. You're on mute, Melissa.
Sorry. Okay. Yes. So I'll jump in here. So just to tell you that I'm really impressed by this infographic or diagram. I don't know what it is, inspired on the classes and the program at Oxford University. So it really covers, many topics that are important under impact measurement. But the title today also goes beyond measurement to discuss management. So what Karim and I are going to do is really tell you where we're at in terms of our perspective based on our work and experience, and share with you different topics. I'm sure that then Karim can go back to this in detail.
Thanks, Melissa. Sorry about that. There's a little bit of background noise. This is a summary that from one of our sessions, the initial session around impact measurement, where you can see there's a lot of different questions around how we frame what IMM is, the questions around why, what, and how. There are different goals around measurement. There's some notion that it might be hard, but we're going to hopefully dispel some of that. And there are a lot of starting points. And so this is just the kind of content that we've covered previously in discussion. We're going to try and give you a peek of how does this get dealt with in practice as practitioners. And what Melissa and I are going to do is essentially provide 3 different perspectives on the kinds of things we are seeing, and maybe to provide some food for thought for our Q&A section. So I'm going to start with the first 3 points, and then Melissa will chime in on hers, really to just set the stage for what we think IMM in practice looks like from our perspective. I would say the first point for me is around mainstreaming IMM. For a long time, I think IMM has been this very niche area, particularly when we talk about measurement. And measurement tends to be quite technical, or traditionally has been. I think a really positive trend is we're just seeing that being mainstreamed in ways that, in a sense, COVID has amplified. And maybe one prominent example is when we think about what ESG looks like, and particularly the S in ESG. There's a lot happening around how we might look at conditions within supply chains, health and safety for workers, etc. I think there's a number of implications for that as it relates to IMM. One big question we've always had in this field is who pays for data, and where's that demand coming from? And I think encouragingly, there are better responses to that, because we know that not only are some of these factors and more material, it's actually creating demand for different kinds of impact data in ways that is more valued, and actually that companies and investors are willing to pay for. So why is that important? I think that's important because this isn't just about saying that IMM is something you do after the fact. The whole concept around materiality, which I'll pick up on in the second point too, is that this data, if it's valued differently, means that it's integrated within what we do, rather than a thing we do after the work. And I think that actually has changed quite a bit. I think the other aspect is that when IMM gets more mainstreamed, different stakeholders are valuing that data differently. Before, perhaps customers used to think that when we buy products or services, it would be nice to have sustainability information. Maybe that's actually a requirement right now. And even though a lot of that is starting with climate and environment information, it is beginning to move in the direction of social information. So I think, again, there are some implications around mainstreaming that can actually address some of the fundamental questions around who pays and who values IMM data. On revaluing, just to build on that particular point, we hear a lot about how difficult IMM is. It's expensive, it's complex, but I think this is an incomplete story. And part of that is because it's always been looked at as a cost center rather than a value driver. And there's an alternative when we reframe what IMM is, particularly its value beyond reporting. As I said, this is the work. It's not the work that happens after the work, if you're working in anything related to impact. And this orientation away from just thinking about reporting to thinking about what value of data and practice around IMM, I think can actually be quite empowering. Much of this is taking place in the private markets. We'll talk a little bit about the standards that Belissa and her team are working on. But I think it's really good news in terms of what it means to shift the conversation away from just thinking about reporting to thinking about the different value of IMM data for how companies and investors think about strategy, how they might think about the kinds of new opportunities that they look at, but also around risk. And so when we reorient our understanding of IMM from being a more technical practice reporting focus to a value driver, something that could have benefits for multiple parties, and that in sense that there are now a demand for it, I think it just opens up a whole lot of opportunities, which we'll pick up on later, because maybe there's a counterpoint here around whether it's an opportunity or a challenge. And so I think the provoking question maybe on this point is, if IMM data has value, how do we best recognize and increase it? Because I think we're still in the early stages of really harnessing the kind of data or the value that IMM can have. Maybe my third point, just as a reflection, is in impact investing, it traditionally has been defined by intention. Over the last 4 to 5 years, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how we integrate some of these practices and standards and tools within all parts of the investment chain. Now we're increasingly focused on the question around integrity. There is a lot of skepticism around impact claims. There will be emerging regulation that will counter impact washing, which is a big part of the challenge right now. And I think one of the big missing pieces that hasn't been talked about yet, beyond developing standards and tools, is actually the understanding of transparency when we talk about integrity, but also the relationship between measurement, strategy, and governance. And practically what this means is that no longer will IMM be something that gets solved for by the analyst that is putting the annual report together. Increasingly, we're seeing it be a function of essentially everybody's job, but also that it's coming up to the board level, and those discussions are becoming much more prominent around governance and accountability for impact. So as we'll talk about later, in some ways, the bottom-up process of being more analytical around IMM is beginning to filter up to think about how to be more strategic about using IMM data, and then also thinking about the role of governance in terms of ensuring accountability for impact. I don't think these are all abstract, because in some ways at each of these levels, and as we'll talk about a bit later, there's very practical implications, whether you are an analyst working in IMM, whether you are a user of IMM data, or whether you are a senior executive or a board director that is working to try and understand the implications of impact data for your company, your venture, or your investment fund. So I wanted to just set the stage in terms of the things that I'm seeing and seeing particularly that are shifting. And then we'll get into a couple of practical examples in a bit more detail later. But let me hand it over to Belissa for her 3 points, and then we'll try and see what resonated with all of you. Belissa, over to you.
Thank you, Karim. First, I have to say I'm fascinated because many of the topics you touch upon, somehow you're ending where I'm going to end, which is fantastic because maybe the message really gets through, which is really important for me for this meeting. So one reflection I had was really regarding reporting, and you talked about that, Karim. There is a lot of emphasis on sustainability reporting, external reporting, and even it took us good news, the COP26 announcement that there's going to be this international sustainability standard board to get really reporting to be more comparable, standardized, and global. And this seems like good news, and they are, in the sense that reporting drives sustainability, but is only one part of the story. And there's so much more than reporting to get where we want to get. Where do we want to get? That's really important. So I hope we all agree that humanity is facing troubled times, right? We've never been wealthier, and we've never been, more advanced in technology, and we're also worried, facing so much uncertainty. So basically, there's need for action, but action at the pace and scale the planet needs. So that's going to get back to my point on reporting. Reporting is important, but it's just one part of the story, because good reporting is preceded by good management. And Karim, you talked about getting IMM to strategy. You mentioned governance. And the standards, the SDG Impact Standards, are really about that. We're going to talk about that in detail. But I think the main point here is not thinking about IMM as an additional tool, as a measuring exercise, but how to embed impact in the way we do business, in the way we invest. And if we think from that perspective, then reporting is just one part of it, right? So if you remember the evolution in financial accounting, first, we developed bookkeeping, we developed management accounting, and then we went to reporting, and then we went to global standards. In the case of sustainability, this is kind of reverse engineering. We're really pushing a lot to communicating the good we're doing, or now with the regulation, maybe that we're not doing harm, but that focus, and that drive, and I'm asking you, and maybe we can discuss about that, is there a trade-off in terms of distracting us from thinking about good practices, management, decision-making? Okay, so that's a reflection that I wanted to bring to you, because from my point of view, and of course it's just one of many, reporting is important, external reporting is important, but what do you do with that data beyond, looking good, or beyond not getting in trouble? How do you use impact data for decision making? And which kind of decisions do we want to make as an organization? Those that allow us to maximize our impact potential in the same way that we would do with revenue and profit, right? Are the revenue projections going as expected? Yes or no? CEOs know that quarterly, maybe monthly. Why? Because then they can take corrective action as needed. They don't look at the annual report for taking decisions. Those are other stakeholders. So let's also think about how we will complement external reporting with the decisions and the internal reporting. Which data do we need to maximize our impact? So that's something that I think it's important to think about as society. And why? Because there's no time to waste. We really are facing, again, big challenges, and the clock is ticking. So we need to accelerate our learning and collaboration to just get where we need to get. The second point, and maybe it's provocative, fear or opportunity. And I'm just saying that because I work with enterprises and funds And there's many people scared of getting out of business, or changing too much, or maybe sustainability is something that they don't know, and then how they're going to address it. And they're really thinking, oh, is the regulation going to affect my business? Am I going to get in trouble? And what I wanted to share with you is that, yes, that's a reality. The world is changing, but that also presents an opportunity. And I think many of you, you're here for a reason, but demand is changing. Consumers are changing. People are changing. We want to work for an enterprise with purpose, right? Investors are changing. And maybe we're not changing as fast as needed, but we are changing, and the trend is clear. So that also presents with opportunities. And to give you an example, we talk a lot about, for example, the demand from new consumers, right? For example, the plant-based meat, that's an example. But there's also other business that and products and services that could be developed to respond to that demand, right? To that change in demand for sustainability. So that's, exploring new business opportunities, given, your comparative advantage as an enterprise. There is also the advantage of working on sustainability to increase your resilience by looking at, from a risk management perspective, your business or your fund is going to be more proof resistant to any future changes, like we have seen in the pandemic, right? We also talk about reputation, right? The social license to operate, which is going to be more and more important. Of course, if we don't have good reporting, many can get away with it, but that's going to change because we're all working on it. And finally, the change in regulation. So managing for impact, including reporting, can really get organizations ahead to be prepared, for new trends and new regulation and new demands. And something that I was reflecting yesterday with a colleague, and I just put it there, Karim, we've never talked about it. Organizations pay, thousands of dollars to consultants for identifying cost reduction and efficiency gains. Imagine that we do that, and when there is an efficiency in the value chain, maybe there's also an opportunity to use that efficiency, to have impact, right? So maybe the organization won't make much more money, but maybe it's going to have more impact. And I really like the slide at the beginning. You see the coins that Karim chose and the little leaf, the little plant on top of it. So what if we count success by that combination? So the total is dollars plus leaf, dollars plus impact. So efficiency gains can really be reused, for example, to really avoid doing harm or doing good. So it's really rethinking your strategy, your processes, your policies, and how you're doing business. And finally, I'm going to talk about, inclusive IMM. There is a lot of efforts going on right now and studies in terms of how do we include all stakeholders, right? Are we reporting for shareholders, or are we reporting for stakeholders? Are we managing our business for shareholders or for stakeholders? So that really takes us, to an inclusive way of doing business and invest. That is really important because, again, what is the problem we're trying to solve? The crisis we're facing, which is not only related to climate, but also social. There are huge inequalities. There are huge social unrest. So we really need to start thinking about businesses and the private sector as a way of maybe building a more integrated society. And we have tools for that. So even when we define, for example, what is success, so what are the impact goals I'm going to focus on, we have to rely not only on data, but also on stakeholders' perspectives. And for that, we need to map them. And we map them, for example, along the supply chain in terms of our products and services, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really changing who we're working for. So we're not working only as enterprises for consumers or for our shareholders. We're also working for a broader society, and that needs to be taken into consideration. And I'm gonna share after, some tools and examples so you can read about that. But at the end of the day, what's the key message is we already engage stakeholders when we do business, but with the purpose of being more profitable. What if we use our same tools, but to think about impact and how can we be most impactful? So those are some reflections, but I will share more after. Thank you, Karim. Back to you.
Thanks, Melissa. So, we try to fit at least what's top of mind for us and what we're seeing. I think a couple of things to point out before we hand it over to you to respond is when we talk about IMM, you've probably picked up from Belissa's comments and mine as well. Traditionally, IMM has been focused on impact investors, you know, the self-defined impact first groups that is actually now broadening to include finance first investors of various kinds, even those that are dipping their toe into impact and those that are aspiring to become impact investors, as well as corporations. And so, you know, consistent with how impact investing has grown, that kind of tent is growing even bigger, you know, showing up in some ways as an ESG conversation, but actually the pushback, I think, around some of the participants in ESG making impact claims is that IMM is becoming even more important in terms of how to address that. I don't think those are the same thing, and this won't be that debate. We won't have it here around the relationship between ESG, impact investing, and IMM, but many of you are grappling with this, you know, in your day-to-day, but I think that's one interesting observation, at least when Belissa and I reflected on the kinds of things that we're seeing and who we're working with. So we just wanted to do a very quick poll, and John, if you could help us just launch this. There's been some overlap in some of these themes, but we want to see what resonated with you. And we know a couple of questions have come in already. So we're gonna now just launch this poll, thank you. And which themes resonated with you? Pick one just so we can get a sense of what, you know, from your perspective, you thought was interesting. We might use that to kind of expand on it. And then in our next segment, Belissa and I are gonna go a bit deeper around some of the questions around standards and practices. So maybe we'll give this another 20 seconds or so. I can see that maybe we have one option missing here, which is reporting and managing. So that's okay. If that was your option, feel free to let us know. And if there's any questions, please include them in the chat. So maybe we'll give it another 10 seconds and then close the poll just to see where people are at. We're trying to practice what we preach when we talk about engaging and listening to stakeholders. So you are our stakeholders. We want to understand what might be interesting to you. There are a couple of questions around standards and standardization and the relationship between standardization and how we think about how broadly or narrowly it really gets at the questions of impact. So Belissa, maybe we'll pick that up in some of our follow-on remarks. Why don't we close the poll just to see what it looks like now. Okay, mainstreaming, IMM, and integration and integrity seem to be quite interesting. So this is actually a really great segue. We'll talk about inclusive IMM, and Belissa, this relates to some of the work I know you're doing in several other countries. So thank you, John. Why don't we move on? I'm going to invite you, Belissa, to just give a bit more about, for those that are newer to the SDG Impact Standards that you've been working on with other colleagues, maybe introduce them in terms of what they're trying to do, how they are distinctive from other kinds of standards, and your initial reflections around what you've seen so far as you've begun to test and implement this with different investors as well as enterprises. And I can chime in based on my own experience as well.
Thank you, Karim. And also there was a question on the chat about it, so I will try to respond that too. So, okay, the SDG Impact Standards. First of all, I just want to tell you that they are about the SDG, but they go beyond the SDGs, okay? The SDGs have an expiration date, which is 2030. So these standards are focused on the SDGs, but also on sustainable development in general. And what we do is really giving a tool for organizations to manage their organizations oriented to impact. So what does that mean? It means that we go a little beyond IMM. So if you look at IMM practices, best practices, they start, for example, what is your goal? How do you measure your goal? You know, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, the standards will tell you, okay, in your strategy, where is your organization most impactful? What could be a priority going forward, given what you already do, where the market is going, like in the same way that you do business. So it's really about embedding impact in decision-making along strategy. Then that strategy gets translated into policies, processes, methodologies to deliver on that, on those strategy goals. Then you report, and then the governance hold this all together. So Karim mentioned this earlier, that IMM is not embedded enough along strategy and governance, for example. So the standards really respond to that. So they are different than any others because there is a lot of focus on high-level principles, and we have a diagram about that I will share too, and I will post the link. So we're not principles, high-level principles like the human rights principles or others. We're not about which metric are you going to pick or how do you standardize a metric, for example, like IRIS Plus. And we're not about for reporting, these are the 5 things you need to report on, like GRI will do, for example. So what the standards are about is what holds it all together. So what does it mean to do business for impact with an impact goal at the core? So we talk about management practice standards, but I was really thinking that maybe it's simpler to say, imagine you take an MBA course, and when you're talking about business and strategy and goals, impact is there alongside dollars. That's what we're talking about. And that's why it's so comprehensive. Yeah. We are aligned, and there was a question to the IMP norms. So we use the 5 dimensions, we use the ABCs and relate to those and to many other standards, tools, and good practices. And I will share the information about that too.
Can I just ask, Melissa, also, yeah. You know, one of the, we've spent quite a bit of time even at the front end just thinking about this relationship between, you know, IMM and how it's shifting from, you know, thinking about expressing your intention to have impact to then integrating it more thoroughly into practice and then dealing with the question around integrity. I like this slide because I think it provides such a fulsome explanation of the different ways in which impact issues show up for organizations, but also I can see we have a question around some of the things that, one aspect that's emerging around assurance and audit. So maybe for those that are less familiar, but also, you know, this is a very live conversation around what does assurance actually mean and what is the purpose of it and how might it be most helpful. Maybe if you can provide some initial reflections around, you know, this slide just in terms of the holistic nature of practice, but also around this kind of tail end around integrating it within assurance and audit processes to get an independent perspective on what that means in the context of the standards.
Excellent, Karim. That's a really good point. And I was reflecting on that because even external reporting is a little part of the story. And you have other mechanisms to avoid greenwashing, impact washing, and one of them is assurance. So we'll go back to that in 1 minute. So how do we translate these management practice standards into action? Okay, so we created these 12 business actions. This is an example for the SDG Impact Standards for enterprises. We also have standards for private equity funds, for bond issuers, and we have worked with the OECD on standards for development finance institutions. So if we go back to these 12 business actions, I think you will see yourselves that it goes a little bit beyond IMM, and it really touches, you know, all aspects of the business. And I think, Karim, you mentioned that too, IMM or impact should become what everybody does in the organization because we all have a role. So we start, you know, by committing to impact, and, you know, we set, you know, the goals, then we're gonna then align the organization and allocate the resources to deliver on those goals. We're gonna track if we are doing as expected or not. And then we're going to disclose information externally to our shareholders, stakeholders, and then the governance body, if we have one, is going to hold us accountable. So if you think what I'm describing, it's nothing different to, you know, maybe somebody would tell you in an MBA course. This is how businesses run. And part of running business is to get audited, right? To get third-party audits that are going to verify that the information is transparent, is accurate, that there are no red flags, and even give recommendations. So the assurance, and I'm an economist, so I had the same question, is a non-financial audit. And what it tries to do is to look at practice to verify in that case, because we are developing assurance for these standards, they are going to verify that you are using the standards, which means that you're managing your business and taking decisions oriented to impact, that are prioritizing impact goals. So the assurance is not about the impact you're having per se. It's not about performance. It's not about measurement only. It's really about how you're managing your business or your fund to get to that performance. So performance, of course, is part of what the assurance is going to look at, but you can be assured positively. We're creating this SDG Impact Seal and maybe you're having a very small impact in regards of your outcome indicator. Maybe you wanted to help 10,000 communities and you ended up helping 5,000. So the SDG impact seal is not going to look at that as bad or good. Of course, it's not as expected, but the standards are going to look at, so what are you doing about it, right? Impact didn't go as expected. Which mechanisms do you have in place to learn from it so it doesn't happen again? So it's really about, I call it the engine, the support system behind an impact indicator or an outcome indicator. So that way you have the full story. The purpose of assurance is to focus on that practice oriented to considering impact on all stakeholders. But also, Karin talked about greenwashing, impact washing. So what we want is to give the market a tool to start, fighting impact washing, SDG washing. So when there are impact claims, we want them to be as truthful and accurate as possible and give a market signal. Because in a world where that doesn't exist, the incentives are perverse, right? Why would I make the effort of changing my whole management system, processes, policies, and do the work I'm supposed to do instead of just having a good report? It costs me a lot of time, it costs me effort, if nobody's going to recognize it. And so, maybe many will still do it, but again, we're talking about change at scale. So that's the purpose of assurance. So these standards are going to be followed. We're developing now the assurance framework, and it's going to be a public good, which means that the methodology used to get assured is going to be public. Anybody can use it. And then we hope to also promote transparency and comparison. So I hope that I answered the question, Karin, but please.
Yeah, thank you, Belissa. And a couple of observations just in terms of why I think this is such a good example of what is changing and what it means. If you look at that first row, as Belissa, you said, much of this is, I assume for people that are listening in, should be straightforward by now, that you're committing to this, you have some SDG alignment, you can set some goals, and then progressively that second row around thinking about the implications for culture, that's much harder in some ways. The ability to then pick or combine a variety of approaches around how you actually measure and integrate. And then the whole set of processes around thinking about what might be material, how you might assess, compare, and monitor over time, that begins to get a bit more, and I wouldn't say complicated per se, but I think it just requires a different level of effort and understanding. So in some ways, that first row, it should be relatively straightforward for any organization that has the term impact or even ESG in what they say they do or care about. This second row is now where we're spending collectively as an industry and field a lot of time thinking about integration and how we might look at various kinds of impact data and practices over time. And this last row, in some ways, is where we need to spend way more time in the future around the changing nature of disclosure, the integration into governance, and then thinking about how might others look at the data and verification and practices and have different interpretations on whether it's good enough, whether it actually is holistic, whether it truly reflects the full range of capabilities and reach of an enterprise or corporation. And those are, I think, much harder questions. And the good news is that 5 years ago, we were at the front end of this process, and those felt really hard. Hopefully, some of these earlier steps around, how you set impact goals, the way that it gets integrated, the impact management project, and others, including the impact frontiers, have a lot of good starting points, I think, for many of these issues. Yeah. And I would just point out, and maybe Belissa, you can just briefly mention this before we move on, in terms of you've published a range of guidance around how different kinds of issuers and enterprises can get started in all of this.
Yes, and just wanted to take one point about strategies. Something that I found in practice is that we pick goals out of what we think is most useful or most impactful, and the standards would really push you towards understanding what are the priorities. So where you can put your resources to have more impact. Like, is SDG agnostic in the sense that in some cases it's going to be SDG 1, in others it might be 5, right? To really understand that having impact and to have that intentionality really needs to come from what are the needs. what do stakeholders prioritize, right, in this specific context where we are operating. So that's really, really important. And the other part is negative impact. So the impact we're talking about here is not just the one we want to have as positive, it's also about unintended negative impact. So that's really, really relevant in the standards. And yes, you have a lot of materials. Thanks, Karen. You did a great overview, so I don't have much to add. So we have a lot of resources. So I invite you to look at it, but if it's too much, email me. I will put my information there because we have the standards, we have self-assessment tools, guidance, and a lot of training that we're doing. For example, this Coursera course with Duke University that's available for free. And we work with Impact Frontier, with IMP, with others to really try to be aligned and provide users with all the tools needed to really move the needle. And again, our goal in SDG Impact is really transform the private sector and to have it as an engine for sustainable development, to create prosperity in a sustainable way and get out of this, crisis we're in at this moment. Thank you, Karen. The floor is back to you.
Okay, so before I hand it over to Richard to take us through some of the questions, I'm just going to share a couple of reflections. So you've heard from Melissa around standards and almost the emerging standards that are being built, but also in many ways the guidance and associated resources that are available. I want to talk a little bit about some other work around ventures, and apologies for the formatting on this slide, but one of the places I'm spending a lot of time with other colleagues, including Laura Buzzina and others who are, I think, joining us here, is a lot of the focus around IMM has been, at least from some perspective, quite top-down. It's being imposed on ventures, particularly in impact investing, and there's a lot of challenges sometimes with how to meet a relatively high bar as the regulations and, in a sense, the expectations continue to grow over time. And so one of the, to give you a bit of a sneak peek into actually a future webinar that we'll be running is around how to think about the response and how ventures navigate the different aspects of IMM. We did a review over the last year, talking to different kinds of impact ventures to say, what's your experience of actually being on the other side? When you look at all the things that Melissa and I have talked about, how do you respond to what IMM looks like within your organization, regardless of where you are in your own scaling journey? What are the ways in which you think about making choices and trade-offs? Because, for many ventures, you obviously can't measure everything. The things that you might want to measure change. And impact investors, I think, increasingly are understanding that it's not a static journey. How ventures and investors grapple with IMM tends to be quite dynamic and fluid. And so in this report that we're going to launch in about a month, we outline a number of ways in which ventures go through 4 different phases, and they can actually go through these phases in multiple combinations. You don't start in one place and end somewhere else. In certain parts of how you think about what is appropriate for you, you may look at standards and say that that's the direction to go in. And other times you have to probably focus on one narrow metric, and that's okay. In other cases, you are exploring a range of possibilities and thinking about even what types of impact questions you might have. And so in what we've heard in the last year is that impact investors are actually using a variety of ways to support ventures around how they navigate these different approaches to thinking about what part of their strategy aligns with IMM approaches. Investors occasionally provide financial and technical support, but they can also do much more than that in terms of how they do that. We provide a range of different worksheets and tools. So just wanted to give you a bit of a sneak peek and stay tuned for that because we'll be hosting a follow-up around this. And I would just say that for some of you, at least I know, another related area is, or question is, a lot of early stage ventures. How do you get started with many of this? How do you get started with thinking about IMM even at the earliest stages of founding a venture and growing it? Another tool that I've been working on with colleagues, you can find at Venture Better, is really a management kind of orientation and set of worksheets around how to think about the questions you ask around your products, services, supply chain, etc., and then think about how you progressively integrate metrics, strategies, and aspects of your context. And I'm sharing these two because, again, this, I think, is indicative of the way we're moving and evolving IMM, to being previously perhaps a much more reporting focused endeavor, one that was really focused on being quite technical, to one that has shifted to the second M in IMM, the management, not just the measurement piece. And there are a lot of starting points around that. And then maybe before we get to Richard, just to say that for those of you that haven't seen this video, another aspect around practice that is becoming increasingly important is issues around data equity. When you work with numbers, they tend to hide or obscure, but also, sometimes by design, integrate issues around equity or equality that need to be much more duly noted and aware in ways that sometimes we misrepresent or don't accurately bring to the table. As we think about the broader set of discussions around what data tells us and how it can be representative or misrepresented, issues of equity and how they show up in data will become increasingly important. So we'll share this link after as well. For those of you that haven't seen this video, it's a very simple one where it shows that everything you know about averages might be wrong because you might be looking at averages from one perspective and not necessarily incorporating the perspectives of other stakeholders. So we tried to pack a lot into this last segment before we get into some of your questions. So Richard, over to you to take us through a few questions and also your own reflections based on your work in this area.
Thanks a lot, Kareem, and thanks a lot, Melissa. It really brings back some of the great memories of Oxford Impact Measurement Program that we did all together, and next one's coming out in September of 2022. So really great to see. I think that this discussion really is one that is on point because as a practitioner here doing an impact investing fund, it is something that we really look at and we struggle with in how to be authentic and how to really show our investors that we are bringing the impact that we say we can. So you have substance over form. I think just to get in, we have about 10 minutes for questions. A number of questions that came through from the participants is around convergence of all these different standards. There's a plethora of standards out there. You have a number of frameworks, standards, and methodologies. And we're really looking to ask, where do you see this going, and to what extent will there be convergence, not just in terms of how to look at one or two standards, but also in terms of reporting as well amongst the managers?
Maybe I'll let Melissa answer this one in more detail. I would just say that the good news is that many of the standard setters, at least from my perspective, are actively talking to each other. They are aware that the reporting burden is going to increase as different groups align and kind of work through them. So there's a bit more interoperability and cross mapping. I think the challenge is still that there is the acronym soup. There are too many to keep up with, and certainly as we look ahead to regulation, that is probably going to make things a bit more challenging before it gets easier. For those of you that have followed the EU taxonomy, you know that it's not a linear path to developing those regulations in particular that are and will be influential. And I think the good news is that we're now distinguishing some of the value add of different kinds of standards for different kinds of organizations. And I think the SDG practice standards are a really good example, which are distinct from, for example, the operating principles for impact management that the IFC and others have promoted in impact investing. Those are interoperable, but in some ways they perform very different functions. And I think for any of our audience who are actively working in IMM or are users of IMM information, just to be able to distinguish the value add of these different standard setters and approaches, and to just recognize what's behind them. Maybe on the I'll direct others to the playlist that Annabelle shared earlier. We do have a couple of webinars where we've talked about some of these standards in a bit more detail. But maybe, Melissa, you're a much more informed voice because this is partly what you're working on hands-on.
Thank you, Kareem, but you're more independent voice, which is always good because I might be biased. So that's an important data point. So there is an alphabet soup, but not all the standards, because they're called standards, are the same. There are standards about different things, okay? So something that I would encourage is first you understand what is it that you want to do. Am I looking to report better? Then there are standards for that. But are you looking for reporting on ESG risks that affect, the financial value of your investments or your enterprise? There are standards for that. If you're interested in reporting on ESG and environmental social aspects that affect, people and planet, there are standards for that. And then and I'm saying this because there is a lot out there, but maybe we're not taking the time of first being really clear about what is it that we're trying to achieve, and then go and look at the standards and then say, okay, this fits my purpose or not. So if we go directly towards, okay, what are the standards? Which one do I apply? And then which one do you apply for what? What is it that you're trying to do? What problem is that you're trying to solve? So for me, that sounds very basic, but it's really important because don't get distracted by standard tool, best practice. They are tools for you. So they need to be useful for you. So that will be my first message. Then if you look at that alphabet soup anyway, our standards and in our website, SDG Impact Standards, we link, in each of these actions and practices, you will have all the links to other standards and practices. So I said reporting is part of how we manage. So we mentioned reporting standards. So you can look at that as a resource because that's going to be helpful. And also the impact management project that phased out convey a lot of standard setters that work in sustainability topics, some of them impact oriented, some of them in terms of financial value. And they have mapped it in a website that also can tell you a lot about what's out there and what you can use. But I would say that if I had to start, I will just try to really be clear about what is it that I want to achieve. And then you pick the standard. Otherwise, if you reverse engineer it, yes, of course, you're going to see 20 tools, and then you're going to feel that you need to apply them all. And it might not be the case. So that would be my main comment. And the second one, we were discussing previously, there's a lot of confusion about terminology. So never assume that you're understanding the same thing as your counterpart. So what do you mean by sustainability? How are you defining it? So your standard is for this, that you define like this. Okay, because sometimes we're using terms exchangeably as synonym, and they're not. So that would be just my 2 cents to get around the alphabet soup, and I'm going to share resources on the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Karim. We have a few more questions really around authenticity and how to audit the data that's coming out. And one question, if I quote here, what are your recommendations as far as best practices to audit your impact data? Most teams are small, and I worry about the efficacy of transparency and reporting. Another follow-on question that just came from OIC on a related, it's basically what advice would you give asset owners in looking to test the authenticity of IMM of the managers that they're looking to invest in? Over to you.
Maybe Melissa, I'll let you respond because this is again, part of your day-to-day. I think one reflection for me in just looking at the very early days of impact assurance in some ways is just to be clear around which decision makers are optimizing for what. And so from an asset owner perspective, if you are looking for impact assurance information, what are you going to do with that information? Are there ways that you will make some different decisions based on your allocations, et cetera? There are different methodologies around how assurance and audit are being done in impact. Some of which I think are fairly transparent about what they're trying to do and are very tight and rigorous, and others that are a bit more open-ended. It's not a judgment right now on what's good or bad. It's just to say that some essentially tell you, whether you're doing certain things at a standard, and others are a bit more open-ended around how you might compare, let's say, to other groups, or what are the ways in which you can improve. And all of that right now, I think is not always clear when either organizations are commissioning an impact assurance approach or are using it in terms of making decisions. So that for me has been something that I think I've noticed as a bit of a tension. And then from the other side, when organizations are essentially being audited, Part of the challenge again is, are they being held to a standard that is commonly accepted, and what does that mean in a very early kind of stage of market development? Or are they really trying to think about where they might have gaps to be able to improve in a way that is commensurate with their strategy and approach and where they're going? And so I guess my core message would be that make sure that the expectations around what impact assurance does and can do are managed and set well across the chain, because I think there's a risk that, at least in the early days, some of those are set out by one party that are not the same as what might be most useful to others. But Melissa, maybe you have a more practical kind of reflection.
No, that was excellent, Karim, as always. Maybe my reflection is, again, we don't even know what good reporting is yet, right? We're figuring it out. We don't even know what good management for impact is yet. We're figuring it out. So the assurers in that context, there's only so much they can do. That's number one. So maybe understanding where we're at, and therefore the market is not yet very developed. That's number one. Then number two, there's a lot of black boxes out there. Okay, that assurers, they have their own methodology, and then they sign, and then you said, okay, Belisa said so, then you rely more on my name than maybe on my methodology, because I'm not sharing it or saying something. I'm not doing that, but it's just an example. So what I would say is that's why we are working on an SDG Impact Seal. But if we reflect on what we're doing, and I joined the team a year ago, so that's why I'm reflecting with you. So first, they developed these standards that fill a gap in the market, because they're about managing for impact, about taking business decisions and embedded in strategy, policies, processes, reporting and governance, etc. That's developed, and then only after developing that and testing it, we are moving towards assurance, right? And we are going to provide a framework for assurance that's going to be a public good. So it's going to be fully transparent. So, but even to get there, assurers need to get trained on how to do this assurance vis-a-vis the standards of practice, which are new. And then, they're going to be ready to provide a more robust assurance. So maybe my point is, and maybe it's not super practical, Karim, that right now the assurance is a black box. We're all learning about this. And what I feel is going to be good, and I'm happy that to be part of the team that works on it. Jeremy Nichols is leading this with a lot of assurance globally that are getting together to think about these questions. Is we're going to provide a public good framework that is going to tell you exactly what do you need to do to be assured, and is going to ensure you that those that provide the assurance are certified and independent. And I think there's going to be more value on that assurance. And then maybe then asset owners will be using it with more confidence. Right now, I would say that maybe it's not the only thing that is going to leave asset owners like, okay, you've been assured. I don't have to worry about anything. We're in a moment when we need different pieces of information. And that's really important. Sometimes I remember I come from international development. The private sector, colleagues, they want the silver bullet, right? The magic response to everything quickly. And this is like a systems change approach, right? There are different elements, there are different components. So it's really about seeing how everything fits together. So assurance is going to give me one piece of information. But for example, assurance on practice is not telling you if there is contribution from your organization to the desired outcome or the desired impact. So somebody talked about impact data. So what is it that you want to assure? Your practice, right? The quality of your data, or you want to evaluate and assess your impact? Because there are methodologies for that, and that's not going to be assurance. It's going to be probably hire an evaluator that is going to tell you, if your intervention or project or what you're doing had an effect or not. And in terms of the question about if I were an asset owner or even investor at exit, what I would look at today, and that might change tomorrow, is really practice, because the numbers, the numbers resist a lot. Oh, given these 55 assumptions and assuming all these 25 things, this is my impact today. Okay, and I'm attributing it to me. I don't even understand how what I did, fits in a system with others, right? So I had an example in a project, and I leave it with this. It was housing, sustainable housing for the poor, people that couldn't afford it. And the outcome indicator was revenue, because, over the period of time of the project. And then the revenue was, very, very high. So the target was met. But then I look at it, right? And what happened is that no houses were built, but there was inflation. So the prices increased, the target was reached, but the project was not on track. So that just gives you a sense of thinking about the holistic approach and what is it that we're really talking about. The numbers resist a lot. So if I'm as an owner, I would look at numbers as a signal that they are trying to measure, that they are committed to it. But what I'm more interested in, and think about VC, Karim, you can help me. When you do VC investing, half of the assessment is who is the team, who is leading, are they committed, do they have the capacity? I would say that with impact is the same, right? So my guarantee would be, are they really fit for making this impact happen? And that is not looking only at data on impact or performance, it's really about practice. And we are going to be working on that at SDG Impact too. It's in our to-do list, but we're a very small team. So if anyone wants to contribute or has idea, please reach out.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you very much.
Oh, Richard, I was just going to say maybe you'll wrap us up now because I know we're at time, but just to say that there are a couple other questions that we can follow up with via email because we do have some webinars and resources available for others. But just to say that thank you for all the questions because I think we covered most of them, but there's a couple that we may not be able to get to, but we can follow up.
Thanks very much, Karim, and thank you very much, Melissa. And before I hand it over to Leila to close us out, I really want to thank you very much. And this is a very, very important topic, one that you have both brought some clarity to, and also more questions for us to think about and more research that we do. And we'll be continuing this topic. IMM will be a nice segue into our next Oxford Impact Collaborative session, which will be on greenwashing, and that will be in March. And that will be something that we'll be looking at in detail and applying these standards. So just wanted to say thank you very much from all of us, and wanted to hand it over to Leila.
Actually handing it over to me, Annabelle. So,
Annabelle, great.
Hello. Thank you everyone for joining today. Just some details up on the screen. If you are interested in learning more about the programs, obviously we've got some amazing alumni that have put this webinar on together today. So we're really grateful to them for all their enthusiasm and work that's gone into kind of organising this and putting together, I guess, an extended experience of the program. So if you'd like to learn more about either impact measurement or any of the other impact programs, my details are up on the screen, as well as the website. But yeah, thank you to Karim and Melissa, who are just brilliant speakers today, and also for the OIC for putting this on and organising it. Thank you.